experience the brutality of your government in World War I. The notion of a war with no winners comes across when you look at some of the ways the governments treated their own soldiers. Italy provides a good example of this. One of the biggest disasters for Italy was the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917. It was disastrous. The Germans and Austrian-Hungarians pushed the Italian army back some 75 miles. There were 200,000 casualties and approximately twice as many desertions within the Italian army. So Italian officers took very harsh, draconian measures against their own troops, often shooting them after court-martial. So there was this idea that even your own officers could be more dangerous than your sort of formal opponent. If you turn to Austria-Hungary, and you think about this time, Austria-Hungary is at the end of their rope. They're basically close to collapsing. But nevertheless, it was possible for the Austrian-Hungarian forces to extract an extremely high price against their enemies, but also their own men. So this sort of, I hope, highlights the dilemma that I talked about that faced all combatants in the war. By October 1917, the Austrian-Hungarian government and soldiers and civilians all would have liked to pull out of the war. But how could they do so when the cost extracted had been so high? What would constitute victory? What would make it worth, surrendering, particularly given the fact that that hostilities started based on Austria-Hungary's actions? In this setting, promises of glory were very thin. The novel I spoke of last week by the Czech author Jaroslav Hasek, The Good Soldier Svek, it sort of provides a literary response to this. So Svek is ordered to the front by a lieutenant near the end of the war for Austria-Hungary, and the lieutenant asks him if he's happy about this. And Svek responds, quote, "Humbly report, sir, I'm awfully happy. It'll be really marvelous when we both fall dead together for His Imperial Majesty and the royal family." Another dynamic is that unrealistic expectations could be very, very dangerous. Romania entered the war in August 1916 on the Russian side, and it's a good case to think about. Because by this time, there had been 2 million already killed in 1915 alone. So King Ferdinand asked the Russians asked his people to join on the Russian side with the hope of gaining territory. And he did this sort of by referring to the great figure from the Romanian past, Michael the Brave, of the 1600s. And he, Michael the Brave, had managed to unite Romania and Moldova through a series of wars. And he sort of maintained this union for 6 months. Ferdinand I, actually, he was a German, and he hadn't spent much time in Romania. Actually, he was related to pretty much every monarch in Europe. But he figured out pretty quickly that given the nature of the war, if he entered on the side of the Entente, there was at least a chance for the expansion of territory over which he would be able to preside. So he invoked this language of ancient glory, and it was mixed with the familiar rhetoric of sacrifice. If you think about the question of winners and losers, Romania is a very good example, because it's actually both. In 1917, the topic for Thursday is the Russian Revolution, 2 Russian revolutions, and we'll talk more about that. So by the end of the year, the Russian war effort had collapsed. And this left Romania completely isolated in this area. And they were forced to sign a sort of a peace treaty or an armistice with Germany in early 1918. So in that sense, Romania could be considered a loser. In November 1918, however, they rejoined the war. Actually, they rejoined on November 10th, so a day before the armistice. So they actually regained the territories of, or not regained, they gained the territories of Transylvania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina. And it nearly doubled the size of their territory. This is a gain. However, it came at an enormously high price. About 9% of the Romanian population was killed during World War I. 700,000 soldiers, but also the civilian population. It's a very high cost for territorial gains. But it brought another cost as well. The territory they gained was at the expense of Hungary. So this ensured ongoing sort of enemy status with Hungary. By 1940, in World War II, they'd already lost most of the gains that they had, or most of the territorial gains that they'd acquired in World War I. So even promises fulfilled came at a very high price. I want to turn to the war outside of Europe. Colonial troops, if you think about it, they ended up losing no matter what side they were on. We know that the British used troops from, quote, the so-called white colonies, Canada and Australia, but also millions of Indian troops were in trenches on the Western Front. The French made extensive use of their colonial soldiers as well, primarily from Senegal. I doubt that it will come as any surprise to you to know that the colonial troops, Canadians included, were used as cannon fodder. The colonial troops were seen as dispensable, and they were usually given, they were the first to go over the side of the trenches and given the most dangerous duties. For people in the colonies, the war also turned out to bring very little that anyone would consider a success. As I mentioned last week, Germany, by 1916, had lost its areas under control, its imperialist control in Africa and Asia, but this didn't bring independence for these nations. Instead, they found themselves controlled by the other powers or by a mandate from the League of Nations. The French and British were in West Africa, Cameroon, Togo, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Mozambique territories of what had been German East Africa were under the control of Belgium, Britain, and Portugal. In the Pacific, New Guinea and Samoa were picked up by other mandates, by the mandates of Australia and New Zealand. So, again, in what sense could this be considered a victory? Even among the so-called white European powers, what did it really mean to talk about winners? Not only those who were killed, but those who survived returned home wrecked. They'd either suffered or witnessed or experienced terrible, terrible destruction. And new forms of warfare brought new forms of injuries. If you have, these next images are quite graphic, so if you have an uneasy stomach or you don't want to see them, just look away. But these are some of the soldier, I hope they come out, some of the injuries that soldiers suffered based on the new technologies. Throughout the war, the course of the war often turned winners into losers. And even treaties, even with the treaties, there weren't really winners. The Germans, from early on, were wildly successful in the East. In 1917, of course, the two Russian revolutions, by the end of the year, the Russians were out of the war. It's one of the goals and one of the promises that the Bolsheviks had made was to withdraw from the war. In December 1917, the Bolsheviks declared that the war was over, and they signed a temporary armistice with Germany. At this stage, they didn't sign a formal armistice because the Germans were demanding what they perceived, and then which would indeed were, very, very, very harsh terms of surrender. So, when they refused, the Germans actually marched into the Russian heartland. In mid-February 1918, the German troops had captured Kiev, much of the Ukraine, the Crimea, and the Caucasus were under German control. They reached the Gulf of Finland, which was only 150 miles from St. Petersburg, or what was then called Petrograd. The Germans offered to stop hostilities. Basically, if the Russians returned all the war materials that the Germans would carry. So the Germans could basically plunder Russia. The terms of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, signed in March 1918, meant that the Russians lost about a quarter of what had been formerly the Russian Empire. These were areas that were the industrial and agricultural heartland of Russia, so the most profitable areas. The Germans claimed a direct zone of influence to East Central and Northeastern Europe. The Bolsheviks agreed to German occupation of the areas that had become or that would become Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. They pulled Russian troops out of Ukraine and Finland. Germany occupied Ukraine and Finland and set up puppet regions. The treaty actually only held up for a few months. But if you think about it, in March 1918, to the Germans, it looks like they'd won the war. They defeated Russia, who was considered their most difficult foe, and won so much territory in the east, beyond what even the most sort of chauvinistic expansionist goals would have dreamed of. So there was this notion of an enormous win. Of course, this win turned out to be illusionary, but this perhaps gives you a better sense of why this war was so difficult for Germans, and why they responded to the peace and to the end of the war, why this loss was so difficult for Germans to comprehend. In their minds, they won the war in the East. The armistice was signed, in the spring of 1918. Ludendorff and Hindenburg were sort of flushed with success over their events in the East, and they tried to create new offensives against France in the West, or in France. They were successful for a while, but they overextended themselves, and so quickly their initial successes were stopped. At this stage, their enemies had allies, or their opponents, I guess is a better word. There was the fresh arrival of U.S. troops. The U.S. added actually 2 million men to the war. The Germans were at the end of their resources. So by September, British, French, Americans are advancing all over the West. The allies of Germany collapsed. Ottoman Empire and Austrian-Hungarian Empire. On November 3rd, 1918, there was a mutiny of German sailors who refused to attack on what they basically felt was a futile and suicidal mission. It was very, very clear to the military leadership, to Hindenburg and Ludendorff, that Germany couldn't fight on. They'd lost the war. So they advised the Kaiser, the Emperor, to sue for peace, and to do so, importantly, before the enemy reached German soil, so before Germany could be occupied. Because that is, Britain, France, and the US are moving, and quite quickly. But Ludendorff and Hindenburg understood that the Kaiser was very, very unpopular internationally. So they knew that if he was in power, the terms of the peace treaty for Germany would not be generous. So they convinced him to abdicate so they could get a liberal government set up to ensure better terms, better peace treaty terms for Germany. On November 9th, 1918, the German Social Democrats declared Germany a republic. The Kaiser escaped to Holland, and he actually mailed his letter of abdication. The armistice was reached on November 11th, 1918. But now the question was, what would be next? Of course, there were celebrations, but there were also huge, tremendous challenges. Things that were broken couldn't be put back together. Old empires were gone, and what would take their place? The principles of national self-determination often endorsed changes that had already been made. There was the redrawing of boundaries, and this made nationalities, at least in theory, the basis for a new order. The creation of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Another significant factor post-1918 was that the order in Europe was not dominated by European powers. Actually, the power was in the hands of the US, and you could actually argue that the US was a winner of World War I. US President Woodrow Wilson. The number of countries, 32, met at the Paris Peace Conference in January 1919, and crafting a peace was no small task. The preceding 18 months, some of the world's greatest empires had collapsed. And so for 6 months, Paris was essentially the capital of the world as peacemakers sought to redraw the boundaries and create a stable and peaceful future for Europe. Although many countries were represented, basically power and the decisions that were discussed were in the hands of the victors, the main victors. American President Woodrow Wilson, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Italy was also considered one of the so-called big powers, but it played a much less significant role than the other three countries. And we'll see this as we move into our talk on Mussolini next week. Austria-Hungary and Germany were not there. They were not invited, and neither was the Bolshevik government in Germany, Russia. To a large extent, the theoretical framework for the Paris Peace Conference was the work of Wilson. He wanted to create a general association that would guarantee political independence and territorial integrity to both great and small nations alike. This, of course, would take the form of the League of Nations. He issued his famous 14 points, but the most critical of these was that all people would be given the right to national self-determination. In other words, all national groups had the right to their own state and the governance of their own affairs. And Wilson argued that these states would be constructed on ethnic or national lines, and that they would therefore be less susceptible to tensions and conflict. I'm going to leave it there for today because we're going to talk about the nature of the treaty and the Versailles Treaty on Thursday, and then move into the Russian Revolution.